G'day, mate. Luke Ford here, back with Mark Gaffney, author of A Return to Eros. Mark, we're still right in the middle of this pandemic. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, there's Luke Levy. First of all, it's good to speak to you. And
Yes,
yes, we are in the middle of a pandemic, and a return to ours is in some deep way connected to the pandemic. But let's just say we're today on, what are we today? March 22nd, right?
yes,
So first, anything we say as of today to the pandemic is true as of today, but it might not be true in 5 days. So
correct.
there's a rolling curve of information, and I think that just everyone has a threefold responsibility. Responsibility as an American, right? It's imperative to America, or to the United States, to handle this pandemic in a way which both protects citizens, right? Protects all human beings in the country, right? And which also protects from the negative potential cascading effects of the pandemic, which are not only immediate health effects, there's first off long term health effects on a number of levels, which I could detail, but there are also geopolitical effects of enormous consequence and significance. And so it's a very, very sensitive moment. On the one hand, everyone has an absolute moral obligation to stay the fuck home, right? If I can quote the Bible, right? In other words,
Yes.
right now, about 1 in 5 Americans is in self quarantine.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of the rolling statistics, Imperial College in London just put out obviously a very important piece this weekend. There were a couple of good analyses of it that were done. One of them was published by Thomas on Medium. His last name Peuyet did an excellent, kind of with a great team, integration of that material. But basically, the basic point of all the rolling material is that if we mitigate and we do kind of relatively low quarantine, the number of fatalities are astronomical, 10 times possibly what we suffered in World War II. It's a big deal, right? And if we suppress immediately, we do an immediate suppression, we can actually flatten the curve and buy time. Because literally every day, we're knowing more about how to respond, both in terms of antibodies, in terms of potential vaccines, potential factors that can actually deal with the disease on multiple levels. We buy time for the ICUs, right, to not be flooded. We buy time, right, to heal, right, and to deal with health workers. We buy time for the supply chains, right, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many cascading issues. So every day that we buy time puts us in a better position. We're not talking about 8 months of quarantine. We're talking about 2 months, approximately, and we can flatten the curve, buy utterly crucial time, and change this from something which is going to be a huge tragedy, whichever way we talk, but the level of the tragedy is so different. We're talking about, God forbid, 500,000 people dying, which is tragic beyond imagination. Right? Every person dying is tragic. Right? Every unnecessary death. We're talking about the difference between 500,000 and 10 million. Right? And so we're right. The stakes here are very high. And I was actually really disappointed that some people in the community, our friend, Dennis Prager, right, did a clip about this being like the flu. I think Dennis has figured out that that's not true, right? I hope he has. I'm sure he has, right? That was misinformation, and it was actually very, very deadly, right, and very, very problematic, which needs to be, of course, retracted. That's clearly not the case. It's very clear that it's not the case. So there's an absolute moral, ethical obligation, right, to engage this properly. And the second issue, Luke, there's 25 major cascading issues here of enormous implications in terms of the multipolar traps, nationally, politically, geopolitically, right, on multiple levels. But here's just one. I'm just going to mention one just to get a sense of it. The Chinese Belt and Road, right, project, which is basically China building infrastructure around the world in the way that America used to, right, is actually a way of both doing good things on China's part, but it's obviously not just a good neighbor policy. It's a way of expanding Chinese influence. Now, Chinese influence per se would be fantastic, right? Chinese influence, American influence, it's all good, but they're not exactly the same. One's a pluralistic democracy, right, America. The other's a totalitarian dictatorship, right? And those are not actually the same thing. They are not actually run according to the same values. So China now is in a position, after having dealt relatively successfully with the pandemic, Luke, they're now exporting, right, their know-how, and they're actually engaging countries in a way that the United States should actually be taking leadership. And it's just a second away from China saying, okay, your dollars are contaminated, we can't use those. You can only use digital currency, which was something that Trump actually stepped in a number of ways, actually stopped. It's one of the things that he really gets credit for, right? We got to be kind of, nuanced, right? He actually did something very important there. And China's rising influence in the world, as long as it represents the values which are against liberty and against pluralism, right? And against spirit per se, right? And against the good, the true, and the beautiful, right? The expansion of Chinese influence. So if you can just kind of imagine, my friend Daniel, framed it this way, right? And I think it was a good way to frame it, who's a kind of situational analyst, right? And coming out of a different world, right? If you think about America before World War II and America after World War II, right? So as we know, Luke, right, the balances of power in the world radically changed. The European powers, right, their power was exponentially diminished, and America's power was exponentially increased, as you know, being a student of history. China could come out of this pandemic, Luke, in the same way. The sets of issues are extremely important, both in terms of the health of every individual, two, in terms of the health of the economy, three, in terms of, right, all the people, 70% of America that actually, right, needs this month's check to buy this month's food. So there's a set of issues that are internal, that are political, that are geopolitical, that are moral, that are ethical. This is not just a question of washing your hands to stay safe. Actually, this is a moment of catastrophic risk, right, in which everybody needs to actually step up and be actually a gorgeous expression of ethos, right, in the broadest way. So I think we can't talk about anything today, right, without saying that, because anything that's broadcast in the world needs to address that directly. Does that make sense, brother?
Yeah, absolutely. So how does one even think about Eros in a time of pandemic when one is facing death in the face, as some people are?
Well, that is right. That's exactly right. I mean, it's actually, this is the time we think about it most, right? Because actually, it's the failure of Eros that's actually, in a deep sense, the root cause, right, of the structures that have allowed us to generate this pandemic. So this pandemic is a catastrophe, right, Luke? It's called
Yes.
a catastrophic event. It's not an existential threat, meaning it's not going to take out planet Earth or the humans on planet Earth, right? Existential threats don't take out the planet, they take out the humans on the planet. And so it's not an existential threat, although it undoubtedly, right, is a dress rehearsal for existential threat. It's a catastrophic threat. Now, a catastrophic threat, this is not a surprise. I mean, take a look. I'll just cite the most popular example. I could cite, reams of literature, but the most popular example, Bill Gates has been talking for years, right, about a pandemic event of this nature, right? And been warning against it, and has said basically that the next major catastrophe is going to be exactly this kind of pandemic. So the nature of a catastrophic event, it has several characteristics, but one of them was it was completely predictable. And we ignored it, right? And we ignored it for a series of reasons. But the primary reasons we ignored it is because, right, we actually didn't have an experience, right, of taking responsibility for our reality, right? We actually thought that somehow pandemics will affect Africa. Pandemics will affect poor populations in Asia, that somehow they won't affect us. There's always been this sense. What's happened with this coronavirus is that actually the virus doesn't give a shit about boundaries, right? Viruses don't care about boundaries. Viruses have what they call an enlightenment, but I'm saying this facetiously, of course, no boundary consciousness. So the virus breaks through the boundary, but somehow we always dismissed the genuine threats as not applying to us. And so we ignored them. But that's connected to a failure of Eros. See, what does Eros mean? Let's talk what Eros is. So let's offer a definition of Eros. What's Eros? What does that word mean? It's a beautiful word, right? It's a Greek word. And actually, scholars of Kabbalah, right, Hebrew mysticism, Luke, and maybe when we talk about Kabbalah, we should call you Levi, right, suggest that the word Zohar, right, which means radiance, but it's also the great book in the 12th century that's sourced, right, in Shimon Bar Yochai, and it's kind of a lineage source, who's the, one of the great masters that lives around the time of Akiva, at the time of the end of the Second Temple period. but it actually emerges in the world in the medieval period, right, in Spain. But the word Zohar and the word Eros are actually saying the same thing. Actually, one of the greatest readers of Zoharic text in this century, an 80-year-old man named Yehuda Libas, wrote a very, very important essay called Zohar and Eros. It's the name of the essay. What he basically says is that Zohar and Eros are referring to the same quality, right? And one of the things that I think Yehuda didn't do sufficiently is define that quality. So but Yehuda did a great job in this article, and I recommend it to you. I believe it's also translated in English, called Zohar and Eros. So I recommend it to all the listeners by Yehuda Liebes, Liebes, or maybe it's Lei, but you'll figure it out, right? He's about 80 today, and he's really one of the great readers of Zohar in the world. So what is Eros? So Eros is the self-evident experience that life is good, right? It's the self-evident experience of radical aliveness, reaching for, moving towards ever deeper contact and ever greater wholeness. That's the experience of Eros. That's actually the nature of reality. Reality is Eros, right? In the East, Luke, people talked about reality as being, right? So you meditate, right? And underneath all the activity in the world, there's the sense of being. Like there's a beingness. And of course, Kabbalah talks about that. Kabbalah calls that ayin, A-Y-I-N, ayin, the sense of being, right? You're sitting looking, if you want to try and access it in your life, you're sitting looking at the ocean. You're totally relaxed. There's no coronavirus, right? You're next to Mrs. Ford, who you're madly in love with. You're gently looking at the ocean. You're leaning back. I don't know if you drink beer, but you're drinking a kosher beer. And you're just in bliss. There's no place to go. There's nothing to do. You're resting, right? You're resting in, as the mystics would say, you're resting in she. You're in being. That's the experience of being. But that's not actually, Eros has a quality of being, but Eros has a second quality, which is becoming, which is urgent, which is moving forward, which is a quality not of spacious stillness, but of ecstatic urgency. That's the quality. So Eros has a quality of being, but it also has a quality of becoming. So Eros is the experience of radical aliveness moving in a direction, right? Luke's going to do an interview today. He's going to create something, right? He's moving forward. He's radically alive. He's moving towards deeper contact with an idea, with a person, with himself, right? And moving towards greater wholeness. So that movement defines life. So for example, you have an atom, right? An atom is fully alive, right? Alfred North Whitehead, the great philosopher of science, talked about an atom's experience of aliveness. We know that atoms actually react to each other. Atoms are actually experiences, embodiments of allurement. Atoms move towards each other, they make contact, then the atoms come together and they form a molecule, which is a greater whole. Molecules come together, they're allured towards each other. There's a radical aliveness at the heart of cosmos. It's what the great Kabbalists called a desire at the heart of cosmos, a chukka, a living desire at the heart of cosmos, brings the atoms together. They create a new wholeness called a molecule. Molecules come together, right? But they don't just come together. It's not a mechanistic function like we thought in Newtonian science. It's actually an allured function. So that's what the Zohar is about. It's about that allured function. My teacher, Mordechai Leiner of Izbuka, calls it chukka. It's the radical desire or eros that's at the heart of cosmos, right? These molecules come together, they form a macromolecule. And they deepen their intimacy, it becomes a cell, right? Et cetera. You get the point, right? All the way up the evolutionary chain. Reality is eros, all the way up and all the way down. You could actually summarize Hebrew mystical thought, which is not a bunch of crazy mystics, Luke, as you know. We're talking about, all the great masters, right? All the great rabbis were, in some sense or another, deeply connected to Kabbalah. Rabbi Soloveitchik, right, viewed Kabbalah as part of his essential identity. So let's just feel into this. Reality is eros, all the way up and all the way down. The best way to summarize the literature is we live in a cosmo-erotic universe. Now remember, this is not about sex. There's 12 billion years of eros before there's any sexuality, right? Eros is what drives cosmos, and it's what drives Luke. It's what drives our friend Dennis that we referred to, right? And it's what drives everything, right? In other words, The experience of radical aliveness, moving to make contact and create more wholeness, right? That's the creative drive of cosmos itself. Now, when you're in Eros, when you experience the inherent aliveness and goodness of your life, creatively moving for contact and new wholeness, you're delighted. But when you're not in Eros and you experience emptiness, right? You experience pain, you experience ennui, you experience desperation, right? That emptiness is almost impossible to bear. So you go to cover up the emptiness, not with Eros, but with pseudo-Eros, right? So the move to cover up the emptiness, that's called pseudo-Eros, right? So every form of addiction, every form of acting out is a form of pseudo-Eros. I want to fill up the emptiness. Of course, the aftertaste isn't good. The aftertaste is actually disastrous. So the difference between Eros and pseudo-Eros is everything. And as Abraham Kook, one of the greatest Jewish mystic rabbis who ever lived, writes, I'm gonna reframe what he says in this language, but essentially what he says is that all breakdowns in ethics, right? Remember ethical monotheism, all breakdowns in ethics come from failures in Eros, right? In other words, you can't make people ethical by giving them a list of rules. Yes, sometimes we need rules to follow, of course, right? That has a place. But ultimately, right, when I act out, right, it's because I'm not in my Eros. I'm not in my aliveness, right? I'm not in, right, the movement in my life towards ever deepening contact and ever greater wholeness. So when I'm not in Eros, I'm in pseudo-Eros. Pseudo-Eros, every acting out, every addiction. Pseudo-Eros is the source of all ethical breakdown. Now, stay with me one more second. We're going to get directly to the coronavirus and what this has to do with Eros. So here's something wild, Luke. Eros is always unique. On the one hand, there's a field of Eros. So both Luke and Mark are in the field of Eros together. It's a seamless field of existence. But Eros configures the quality of Eros that's Luke is different than the quality of Eros that's Mark. So Eros is always unique. Every human being is a unique configuration of Eros. So when you're living your unique self, right, when you're living your story, right, when you're in the unique vector and trajectory of your creativity, moving towards the contact that's appropriate to you, right, that's in some profound sense aligned with your essential identity, right, and you're creating new wholeness within yourself and in your relationship and your creativity, right, you're in that full Eros of your unique self, you're delighted. When you're not, well, then you have this incredible sense of emptiness and pain. So then pseudo-Eros steps in, right? So that's the principle. But let's get it. So what happens? So when you're in your story, you're in Eros. When you're not in your story, you got to create some sort of false story to cover up the emptiness. The false story is pseudo-Eros. So I'm going to give you an example of 4 false stories that dominate every single person you know, Luke, without question. Well, maybe there's a couple of exceptions, but almost everyone in your life and in my life and in life in general. Since we don't have a genuine story of Eros in which I'm a unique configuration of Eros, right? I'm a unique configuration of that quality of desire, that quality of intimacy. I'm a unique configuration of Eros, intimacy and desire, right? Moving towards ever deeper contact and ever greater wholeness. That's the definition of Eros. And the same Eros that moves molecules and atoms moves Luke and Mark. That's what we call God is one. That's what we mean when we say God is one. It's not a cute statement. It means the same qualities of existence operate all the way up and all the way down the chain of existence. So the same Eros that moves atoms to come together to form a molecule moves Luke, right, to make deeper contact and form a larger whole. That's what we mean. Shema Yisrael, Adoshem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Right, hear, O Israel, Lord our God, the Lord is one. Echad means it's one universe. It's one cosmos. There's one set of core principles that operate all the way up and all the way down. That's stunning. That's really beautiful. So we begin to see, okay, so when you're not living in Eros, you're not living in your authentic, unique self story. You don't understand that your story is part of the larger universe story, that your love story is part of the universe, a love story. You don't understand your place in the whole. So what you do is you create false stories. Here are four false stories, and then I'm turned back to you. False story number one, a success story, right? Win-lose metrics. I win, you lose. That's our system today. Everyone's in a win-lose metrics. Every department of government and almost every human being within relationships, between departments, between companies, right? Win-lose metrics. I win, you lose, right? So I'm not really an Eros. So I got to place you on outside the circle to give myself an illusion of being inside the circle. Being in the circle is being an Eros. Being outside, symbolically outside of Eros, you've got to lose for me to win. That's a success story. That's one form of pseudo-Eros. A second form of pseudo-Eros is a victim story. That gives me a sense, right? A third form of pseudo-Eros is, right, the hero's journey. I take my separate self. I'm a separate self, and I'm taking my psychoanalytic hero's journey. Now, it's not that that's not valid. It's valid. It's just too small, right? Just like the victim stories, it doesn't fill me up, right? It's a form of pseudo-Eros. And finally, the fourth limited story that doesn't fill us up is romantic love, right? Now, we've made the romantic love story everything, right? As Robert Solomon, the philosopher, he was in the University of Austin for a while, a brilliant guy. He wrote, "We've killed all the gods except for Aphrodite." What he meant is the only story we've left is that love story. But we make that love story everything, and it can't fill up everything. It's limited. So the limited romantic love story, the victim story, the hero's journey, the success story, those are all forms of pseudo-Eros. What drives our reality, a reality that ignores potential pandemics, a reality that ignores impending ecosystem events, a reality that ignores exponential growth of fractional reserve banking, a reality that ignores the fact that we have more exponential tech that creates exponential disaster, right, in the hands of state actors and non-state actors. We have more rogue possibility of weapons than we've ever had deployed to state and non-state actors. We have more, right, et cetera, et cetera. What allows us to ignore all that is we split it off from ourselves, right? We ignore it, right? And what creates all of it is these stories, win-lose metrics, success story, right? This narrow sense of a separate self. We pat ourselves in the back with a little quick romantic story, and that's it. And our sense of identities becomes so small, right? So limited, so stunted. So in some sense, it's the failure of Eros that creates the win-lose metrics, that creates the exponential growth curves, that actually allows us to ignore all the factors that are a pandemic in the making. To not allocate resources, right? To believe it's going to actually affect the poor and not us, to split off from that which we can't see, not to experience reality as one world, which is what Eros is about. It's an indivisible one world that we're all participating in. All that gets left aside. So it's actually the failure of Eros, which is the source of the failure of ethics. It's only a restoration of Eros, a return to Eros, if you will, that allows us to reenact ethics, to reenact our identity as unique selves, to reenact our vision of ourselves as a community, as a unique self symphony. All of that depends on reclaiming Eros at the center. So that's just a sense of it. That's just a fragrance of it. How'd you do? Did you make it through?
Yeah. One question: why is the hero's journey? Why is the hero's journey false?
Not false. It's limited. It's not false. That's really important. Thank you for the clarification. It's not false at all, right? It's valuable. Just like romantic love's not false either. It's just limited, right? And it's Joseph Campbell's version of the hero's journey. Is what he did is he did a great job. He took essentially themes in mythology, wove them with psychoanalysis, if you've read his work. Right? So he basically weaves psychoanalysis into the hero's journey, and it becomes about, right, the individual's very personal story. Now, that's beautiful. That's valid. It's just limited because what it basically says is, who are you? You're a separate self, right? You're a skin encapsulated ego on your own journey, right? And your journey, has all the psychoanalytic depth, and work it out and work with it, which is beautiful. It's just limited because I'm not a separate self. It's actually not true. The essence, the entire essence of all spiritual thought is that in one way or the other, I'm not a separate self. I'm part of, right? My ani, let's say it in Hasidic terms, right? My ani, right, is part of the ayin. When I would talk to, if you remember right, I didn't know him well. We spoke only 2 or 3 times. We had a wonderful conversation, which I know just how people refer to him. I'm sure you were good friends with him. I think we mentioned him once, Schwartzy.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Oliver Shalom, right? So
Yeah.
we used to talk about the ani, the I, becoming part of the ayin, right? It's the same three letters in Hebrew, Aleph, Nun, Yud. So the ani, the I, which is the separate self, actually realizes that it's actually part of the ayin. It's part of the seamless code of the universe. There is no ani that's separate from the ayin. That ultimate separation is not true, right? I participate, right, in the ayin. And when I love, so when I love you, and love doesn't mean just romantic love, right? When we love each other, whatever that love means, the boundaries between us collapse. We realize we're connected to each other. We're part of one field, right? So sometimes we realize that with just one person that we love, but if we expand that from egocentric love, me, my family, my people, wow, I can love all of my people. I'm one with them, but then I'm one with all human beings. Then I'm one with all of reality. I'm part of this larger field of Eros. So the hero's journey, right, actually is in a Freudian psychoanalytic mode of separate self. That's its weakness. Within that frame, Luke, it's fantastic. Same with romantic love, right? Romantic love is beautiful, but actually, what the masters were talking about, the great rabbis were talking about what I call outrageous love, which we call in Tehillim, right? In Psalms, we call it ahava azah. Literally means outrageous love, meaning the love that is the not just human sentiment, the love that's existence itself. So when I love, I don't want to be just loving as a social construction between two human beings. I want my love for you to participate in the love that drives all cosmos. Right? In Kabbalah, we call that, Luke, ahava lifnei bria and ahava achar bria. Love before creation and love after creation. Right? And by the way, Reb Shlomo Karlbach used to love this Torah. Love before creation and love after creation. Love before creation is love that's not reactive. It's the love that sources creation. It's the love that suffuses everything. It's the love that moves atoms to become molecules and molecules to become cells and single cells to become multi-cells and to go all the way up the evolutionary chain, right? From the neural net to the neural cord, right? Limbic system, right? All the way up to hominids that whole story. But the love that drives that whole story is the same love that lives, right, in Mordechai and Levi and Mark and Luke. But that's the point, right? It's not ordinary love, right? It's not love after creation, which is the human expression, right? It's love before creation, which suffuses the whole system. That's what we mean by Eros. That's what Eros is. Eros is that love that drives the whole system, that lives in me, right? So I'm actually aligned with reality when I awake and live in Eros. When I don't live in Eros, or even worse, when I try and fulfill or reduce Eros to the sexual, right? So if you said to somebody, you said, hey, I was talking to, this guy, Dr. Gaffney about Eros and erotica. They'd say, you're talking about sex, huh?
Mm-hmm.
You'd say, no, we didn't mention sex, actually. What are you talking about? Right? Because we've reduced the erotic to the sexual. It's a huge mistake. Remember, there's 12 billion years of Eros from the inception of reality until we get past asexual reproduction. Eros is the allurement that drives everything, that holds everything together and drives it forward, what Alfred North Whitehead called the creative advance of novelty. That's Eros. Now, one expression of Eros is the sexual. The sexual is one arena in which Eros expresses itself. But the sexual models what Eros is. It doesn't exhaust Eros. Right? So what we do, Luke, is we try and fulfill all of our essential need to be aligned with and to incarnate Eros. We try and fulfill all of our erotic needs, if you will, in sex. And of course, it collapses because we're asking sex to do something it can never do. Right? We're placing the entire burden of Eros on the sexual. It's a disaster. Right? Of course, the sexual is going to collapse, which is exactly what it's done. The sexual has collapsed on itself because it's our last outpost for Eros. But actually, you want to live in Eros as you're writing your blog. You want to live in Eros as you're doing the Alexander method. You want to live in Eros as in every interaction you have. You want to eat and sleep, and you want to jog, and you want to exercise, and you want to create, right? All of that is an expression of Eros. I want to live erotically in all the non-sexual dimensions of my life. And then my sexuality will also be an expression of the larger field of Eros. Otherwise, sexuality collapses on itself. unable to meet the burden of Eros that we've placed upon it. Wow.
Now, Eros, its origins are as a Greek word, and it began right as a god, as a god of love and sex. But the meanings that you're talking about are considerably transformed from that. So I'm looking at Wikipedia. Eros as a concept, when it's used in philosophy and psychology, it's used as equivalent to life energy, which is what you're talking about. You're talking about it in a similar way to the way that Plato, Freud, and Jung talk about Eros.
That's correct, with some very important distinctions, right? In other words, they did talk about it, that the idea that Eros is the life energy, right, is a very, very critical idea, right? Freud and Jung did very different things. Plato did something else. They can't quite be grouped together. What we've done is we've tried to actually define it much more clearly. And I'm actually shaped by the Kabbalists. That's the major source. Of course, I'm deeply enamored of Plato and madly love Freud, and Jung on his good days had some important things to say, and his bad days was problematic, right, for lots of reasons, right? But actually, Eros is the idea of Zohar. It's the base idea of the reality is Eros, or you could say differently, God is Eros. God's not only Eros, but God's Eros, right? Right. That is to say, right, the life force, right, that actually moves everything, right, that holds everything together, right, that takes separate parts and makes them into larger wholes, that creates wholes that are greater than the sum of the parts, which is what we call emergence in evolutionary science. What moves all that? Right? So science doesn't know what to do with that, right? Science talks, as you know, about four forces: the strong and the weak nuclear, the gravitational, and the electromagnetic. But what animates those four forces, right? So what animates, Eros is not a fifth force, right? Eros is that which animates the four forces all the way up and all the way down. So God is Eros. Now, that's not God's only expression. God also has a personal expression, right? God has a expression within me. It has a second person, a first person within me, right? It has a second person. God's talking to me and holding me. But God's also a third person force, right? The Zohar says God is ani, ata, and hu. I, you, and he, or it. First, second, and third person. So the third person of the divine, if you will, is Eros. Right? The quality of Eros is the quality of divinity. And by the way, holy brother, right, before I wrote Return to Eros is a kind of, which I wrote with Christina Kincaid, Dr. Christina Kincaid. Return to Eros is a kind of magnum opus on Eros. If I would place that in an intellectual history, so, Marcuse, right, wrote on Eros, right, but he talked about Eros, right, in relationship to Marxism. And then Norman O'Brien wrote one of the great works he wrote on Eros, Love's Body, he wrote on Eros itself, but that was Eros in relationship to psychoanalysis, right? I think the real new work on Eros is this book, Return to Eros, and it's been talked about in scholarship as well. I think Dr. Zach Stein from Harvard wrote a beautiful review called The Metaphysics of a Return to Eros, right? On Eros and a Time Between Worlds, which is a great academic essay on this work. But we're not talking about Eros in relation to Marxism or Eros in relationship to psychoanalysis. We're talking about Eros as the evolutionary impulse itself, as the divine impulse itself that lives as Luke, right? When Luke is in Eros, the world works. When there's a collapse of Eros in Luke, then there's going to be a collapse in ethics, right? Unless he can manage to fill up with Eros again. And I fill up with Eros again by just getting very quiet and letting the Eros that is my nature fill me. But you can't talk about ethics without Eros. There is no good ethical discussion without Eros. And I don't know if you're aware, probably not, but actually right as you and I met, not directly, but I think we crossed each other's paths sometime in 2002 or 3, right? I wrote an article that a gentleman invited me to write who edits a magazine, a Jewish magazine called Tikkun. And the cover of the magazine, right, was an article in 2003 called On the Erotic and the Ethical, which was a cover article I wrote on this relationship, right? And all the ethics folks in the Jewish community were furious. What, ethics is ethics. Eros is the opposite of ethics. No, that misunderstands the entire tradition, right? In other words, when the God in me collapses, And the God in me is the Eros in me. It's the full aliveness of my being. And the full aliveness of my being comes from a constant movement towards deeper contact and more wholeness, whether that's intellectual, spiritual, emotional, psychological, right? That's the movement of my life. When that movement breaks down, I'm empty. When I'm empty, I move to fill the emptiness. What do I fill the emptiness with? With pseudo-eros, right? So this is core. This is not a tangential idea. It's not a peripheral idea. It's at the utter heart of Chokhmah Ivrit, of Hebrew wisdom, or as Schwartzy would say, Yiddishkeit, right? But it's at the heart of how we have to create also a shared language of spirit in the world. The coronavirus is a failure of Eros on multiple levels, right? And so we've got to deal with the coronavirus directly medically now, of course. But we also have to restore Eros, restore the sense of wholeness, the sense of interconnectedness, the sense of the intimate universe, right? The source that I'm not just a success story. It's not just win-lose metrics, right? And I'm not just a limited romantic story. I'm not on my private hero's journey. My story is not just a victim story. My story is a unique self story. I'm a unique configuration of Eros, right? My Eros, my love is part of the love story of reality, which is the movement of reality to ever higher freedom, consciousness, and order, ever higher wholeness. That's why Rav Kook, maybe I'll finish here on my side. Rav Kook writes in the second volume, Luke, of Erotic Mystics, the Lights of Holiness. He says, more than any other philosophical teaching, I'm translating from the Hebrew now. He says, Torat Patchut, right, the great Torah of evolution, fits the secrets of Kabbalah more than any other Torah. But what he meant was not the technical details of evolution. He meant the notion that there's an evolutionary eros that drives all of reality, right? That evolution is this evolutionary impulse that's constantly creating, constantly moving reality forward. That creation was not a one-time creation that happened X amount of time ago, and now it's over. There's a constant creation driven by an evolutionary eros that animates all of reality. And that evolutionary eros lives uniquely as Luke Ford. Reality is having a Luke experience. Wow, right? That's a life worth living. And it's the birthright of every human being.
Now, rabbis, the Gedolim, would never be caught dead using the word Eros, would they? I mean, I've never heard any Orthodox rabbi talk much about Eros. It just would shock.
Rabbis wouldn't be caught dead doing a lot of things that they should be caught alive doing, right? But it's a different conversation, right? In other words, I think that there's a lots of languages for Eros, right? But it's actually a very helpful word, right? Zohar is the best equivalent, right? But it's more than that, right? It's in Hasidism, in Hasidut, there's lots of conversations that have to do with Eros, and there's a whole series of words. One's a word called hitpa'alut, which is the ecstatic presence, shuka, right? The kind of the living desire, right? Those are all Eros words. There's a whole series, right? When in Hasidut, they talk about this radical commandment to joy, simcha, and it doesn't mean happiness in that superficial sense. It's talking about the joy that emerges from a life lived in Eros, right? And so the language is a very important language. And as you know, Maimonides, the Rambam borrowed very important language from Aristotle, right? As we know, right, Nachmanides, the Ramban, borrowed very important language from Plato, right? And so actually the notion that we actually find a word and we reinvest that word, right, with new meaning is a beautiful and a sacred tradition in the Orthodox community. It's always been done, right? There's always interpenetrating influence, but it's not between Jewish and not Jewish. This is a core idea. This is a structure of reality. It's not owned by Jews or not Jews. It's the nature of existence itself. So whether you want to call this word Zohar, as Yehuda Liebes suggests is the Hebrew word for it, or you want to call it Eros, I've chosen Eros as a more universal word because it's an easier word to transmit into the broader culture. But by Eros, I mean Zohar, and by Zohar, I mean Eros. And by the way, Luke, right, I had the privilege of writing kind of like a Jewish version of this book first. which was called The Mystery of Love. You know what I just remembered? Actually appeared on your friend Dennis Prager's show.
I
We
remember
did
2004.
right on The Mystery of Love. I had forgotten that.
His wife
Right,
loved your book.
right. It was on
Dennis
that
had
show.
a harder time getting his head around it,
I
but
just had a
his
hard time
wife
getting
loved
it.
it. Yeah.
That's right. But I had forgotten that. That's right. That's right. So that Mystery of Love is about Eros. Right? That's the core of the Return to Eros. It's not, it's about half of it, but half of that material is there. But there, at the end of Mystery of Love, there's 40 pages, Holy Brother, of primary source footnotes from Jewish, mystical, Kabbalistic, and Hasidic and Talmudic sources, right? Sourcing all the ideas of Eros in the Hebrew Jewish lineage. So you might love those footnotes.
Hmm. And
Yeah.
you got Warren Farrell to write a foreword to this book. I think
Warren did.
a lot of people are aware of his amazing work, but you've known him for a long time. So can you say
Warren,
anything about?
Warren's a good man. He's been a close and dear colleague for many years. He's actually the vice president of education for the think tank, and we were actually very happy to help energize and support his work. I met him quite a few years ago, back in 2000, and a long time ago. Actually, Ken Wilber originally introduced us back in with thought of introducing us like in 2004. I think we finally met somewhere closer to 2005. There was some trajectory like that, 2006, 7. And we've taken many walks together, and we've shared ideas deeply. And Warren had actually kind of in a certain sense completed his set of very important books, The Myth of Male Power, which was the best one. And I actually said to Warren, like, I think you're just beginning. You've got a whole nother set that the world needs. And Warren actually wrote a book called The Boy Crisis, which I was privileged to help kind of arrange the contract and, through the think tank, help it, get into the world. But it's completely Warren's work, right? 1,000%, right? Warren and John Gray, who's also a member of the board of the think tank. John wrote Venus and Mars. And Warren's work is, I think, in the issue of boys and men, incredibly important. Right? And I think Return to Eros was very important to Warren and very important to Barbara Marx Hubbard, right, who is a great futurist. I don't know if do you know Barbara's work, Luke, at all?
No.
Yeah, Barbara Marx Hubbard was kind of the premier evolutionary futurist. Do you know Buckminster Fuller, Bucky Fuller?
Yes.
Bucky Fuller said about Barbara, she was the most informed human alive, right? She was one of the great futurists who just passed away about a year ago, literally 1 year ago. She, was very good friends with Jonas Salk and, Bucky Fuller, helped form the World Future Society, and really brought the idea of conscious evolution into the world. A very, very important thinker. So I actually had the privilege of introducing her and Warren, and they were among the group of thinkers, right, who make up the Center for Integral Wisdom.
Now, you're linked to a philosophical school of integral theory, which I really don't know much about, and I don't know a lot about integrity, but I'm getting glimmerings that integrity has something to do with wholeness or oneness. So is there any connection between a return to Eros, wholeness, oneness, integrity, and integral theory?
So that's a long set of synonyms there. But I would say one, right? I'm dear friends with Ken Wilber, who's the founder of integral theory. I have been a thinker in integral theory, although that's not where I locate myself today. I locate myself in relationship to Ken, and Ken's work has been a scaffolding, right, for some key pieces of our work, which is what Ken intended. And I'm delighted to talk to Ken regularly. I think he's really one of the great beings, right, in terms of his contribution and in terms of dimensions of his beingness, which are just incredibly beautiful. And we talk regularly. And I wrote the Unique Self book within the context of integral theory. Ken actually called it a new chapter in integral theory, and he wrote the introduction and the afterword and the forward to Unique Self. But what we've done is we've actually, with integral theory as one of the meta theories which scaffolds, right, a key meta theory that scaffolds, we've actually created a new stream of thought, much like there's romanticism in the world or existentialism. So what we're doing at the Center for Integral Wisdom is creating something we're calling it, the name we're giving it is cosmo-erotic humanism. That's the name, cosmo-erotic humanism. right? It's a high name, but we think that's the right way to go. And it's actually the core of this new story. And it's about the fulfillment of Homo sapien sapien, as Homo more. The emergence of a new narrative of human identity, a new narrative of community, a new narrative of economics, of medicine, of education. So we're trying to make what I would call, with enormous humility and audacity and prayer, what I would call the Da Vinci move. Right? Da Vinci lives at a time between worlds in Florence. Right? Pre-modernity is over. The Black Death has swept Europe. Right? There's enormous pain and suffering. There's a need for a new story. That new story is the story of modernity. So you could call the Renaissance accurately a time between worlds. So we're again, Luke, we're in a time between worlds, right? Modernity has run its course. Post-modernity has collapsed. There's no new story. There's no new narrative. We're at a time between worlds. We're at, if you will, a time between stories. And so we need to make a Da Vinci move at this phase shift in human history. And that's about the telling of a new story. And we're at a crisis, but crisis is an evolutionary driver. So we're working together. Integral theory is an important scaffolding, but it's really an entirely new emergent. Again, I would think about it in terms of romanticism or existentialism, right? It's that kind of movement. It's called cosmoerotic humanism. There's about 24 major thinkers involved in different levels. Right now, without hyperbole, without kind of exaggeration, without hyperbole, there are about 16 unpublished volumes that we've completed in the last several years. We have another 15 volumes to go. We'd like to publish essentially an entire 30-volume great library, a kind of Renaissance level great library, right? Which actually we hope will be exactly what's needed at this moment, right? As the book of Esther says, Mi yodea lim le'et kazot, right? Who knows if everything happened, Luke, in order for us to be just in time, for a time like this. And I pray that that's, yeah.
Okay, I know that this is the end of a very long day for you, so maybe I'll just make this the final question. So looking at the cover of this book, the subtitle is on sex, love, and eroticism in every dimension of life. So pretty much everything we've talked about tonight, we would not have needed the word sex or anything close to the word sex. But there it is, rearing its ugly head on your cover. Sex, love, and eroticism seems very sexual.
But I would say like this, right? Sex, right? First off, sex doesn't have an ugly head, just to be clear, right? With all due respect, and I love you madly. But the sexual as an expression of Eros is beautiful, right? The sexual is a beautiful expression, right? It's an expression of Eros. When we ask sex to fulfill all of Eros, then sex gets distorted, right? Then it gets, right, twisted, right? Then it gets, right, that's where the trouble starts. So sex, love, and eroticism, right? Eroticism and love, right? And sex, right? Those are dimensions of life. And by the way, sex is much broader than what we normally talk about sexuality. The way we define sex in our kind of larger work, which is the phenomenology of Eros, which we're now completing, is sex is the experience of touch between human beings. Right? That's a very much broader definition. But in any case, sex has its place in the holy. Right? If you remember the mystery of love, you have two sexually intertwined cherubs, right, above the Holy of Holies. And we have to kind of get over this splitting off of desire. We need to restore dignity to desire, but to actually reclaim sex as an expression of Eros. We need to up-level the sexual to the erotic and not to downgrade the erotic to the merely sexual. That's the move, right? And that's the most holy and beautiful move we can possibly make.
Okay, thank you, Mark Gaffney, author of A Return to Eros, The Radical Experience of Being Fully Alive, written with Christina Kincaid. And let me